Great. So I'm Yolanda Leite. I'm an assistant professor here at the Division of Robotics, Perception and Learning. And I work in human-robot interaction. So why am I here? I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective on human-robot collaboration, which I guess robots are a type of cyber-physical systems, right, Martin? So if I have to summarize what I do in one sentence, it can be something like this. So my goal is to enable efficient and engaging collaboration between robots and people. And to do that, I need to build and evaluate these systems that enable robots to capture, respond, and learn from like these really complex but sometimes subtle dynamics of real-world social situations. Today, I'm going to talk more onto the evaluation part of things. So in a way, in essence, like how humans perceive robots, because that's also a very important way as we have more and more humans in the loop in these cyber-physical systems and digital systems in general. It's becoming a more critical aspect of it. So this is like my perspective on this that I'm going to be talking about.
Can you try to avoid people even outside beam from the projector?
Okay, sure. I'll stay here.
Exposed and then you get dark and blue in your face. So, yeah.
All right, so I'll stay in the corner here. So why is this important? Why we need robots around us and not only in factories or labs and isolated from the world? We have a very aging population. For example, here in Sweden, 20% of the population is above 65 years, and this is a common trend in many of the developing countries. And at the same time, people don't want to go to nursing homes. They wish to live independently in their homes for longer. So robots can help people to live independently for longer, as we have also very aging population and lack of human resources to assist and to want this type of jobs. We have a lot of flow of people. So here in Sweden, again, the example, we're expecting almost 1 million new immigrants every 5 years, in the next 5 years. And a lot of these immigrants are, families with kids who go to the Swedish schools and they don't speak the language, and teachers don't speak the native language of these children. So you can think of like having robots or a source of technology assisting and personalizing education for helping these kids to catch up with the language and to promote collaboration between children and so on. But also in collaborative in workplaces. So we will see more and more robots collaborating with the people in assembly lines, carrying things around in hospitals so that nurses can provide the right, necessary support to patients. And in even these cases where, the robot doesn't even look human-like or it's not in a completely social environment, we need to address these how people and robots collaborate together, because this is very important for acceptance, for people to actually use the system and for them to be valuable in a way. So this is not only me who says that. In the suggested reading, the paper that I suggested, I took this citation. So as complex automation continues to approach increasingly more advanced intelligence autonomous systems, the value of this system resides not in the total replacement of the human controller, but rather in the capacity for human-system collaboration. So I have this very positive view of technology that they can work together to empower humans in the same way that computers now help us to do a lot of different things, or mobile phones and so on. So along these lines, it's very important to understand how people can actually trust this system, so the theme for the summer school. And it's not always a straight answer to this. And I think that's like the main message from me for you today. There are, according to the paper that I recommended, they developed this three-factor model on all the different factors that might affect how people trust these autonomous systems. And they can be human-related, so individual traits such as our own age or gender, ethnicity, whether we are stressed or not while using the system. They can be related to the system, so how autonomous the system is, how it is communicating with the user, which in this case, the people. But they can also be like environment related to the collaboration between the teams and so on. So the outline for the two slots that I have here with you today are going to be as follows. So today, in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to present you 3 different case studies that are, experimental works on how people perceive robots in different settings. And then tomorrow, we're going to analyze these case studies in a bit more detail. So I'll divide you in 3 groups, and each one of the groups is going to be assigned to one of these case studies, and you're going to discuss based on what could be the factors from the 3-factor model here that could be influencing the results and from these studies that I'm going to show you. Any questions? Or maybe it will be more clear later on when you have the opportunity to ask questions. But so no required homework or anything. We can do everything on the fly. So tomorrow we can have maybe 20 minutes for you to discuss, and then also a 5-minute presentation on just your main findings. It doesn't have to be slides. It can have some notes, and one of the group representatives can come here, and then we have a final discussion. Does that sound good? All right. So let's start with the case studies, and I chose from my own previous work different things that we have done in the past. So I'm going to start by one of the case studies of how people perceive robots when they fail during a collaborative task between people and robots. How humans perceive robots when robots get too close. So this notion of when robots might eventually violate our own personal space. And also how people perceive robots when they disclose private information. And this one is a study that we've done with a very particular age group that, well, not going to spoil it, but yeah. So I'm going to quickly go through these today, and if you have any questions, you can, feel free to ask, or if this is too out of your, no. So let's start with the robot failure. So we're not the first ones studying this. There has been many researchers trying to understand, what changes when robots fail while, providing some service to people or something like that. And the truth is there has been some mixed results on this. So some studies show that, robots failing is a good thing because they become a bit more human-like or something like that. But also that can have negative effects. People stop, trusting the system, stop losing interest of using the system, and so on. What we found was that in the literature, most of these failures don't have really personal impact on the person, right? It's like robot failing while trying to get a banana from the snack bowl and not delivering banana to the person. So this is not really a critical error. So what we have done here was trying to experimental study the high impact of the robot failure. Sure.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to ask, when you talk about robots, if you think all the way from a coffee machine to an automated vehicle to a humanoid.
Yes, so
what's your scope?
robots can be everything. An autonomous car is now a robot, right? Yeah. So a lot of the robots that we will be talking about are these sort of a bit of more human-like robots. So in the 3 studies, 2 of them are with this Pepper robot, which is about this height, and it has some human-like capabilities, as you will see in the video. And these are great robots to study human-robot interaction because, they have some sort of social stance already just by their appearance that makes people, intrinsically motivated to interact with these systems. But it can be just, two robotic arms or something like that. So this is the type of robots that I'm talking about in the next for today. So the type of task, we needed to come up with a collaborative task. So we designed this escape the room scenario where one person and the robot needed to collaborate to escape the room. You know, these activities where you need to unlock things to, or you're stuck in a room forever. So we simulated that in the lab environment, and there were certain things that the robot had to do. So people really had to collaborate with the robot. So this was like a 15 to 20 minute task. And the way we manipulated this high impact or low impact failure was, in one of the conditions, the robot had no failures at all. It was perfect robot because also we were, there was a human behind it. So we were following this experimental protocol that we call Wizard of Oz. So there was a human wizard manipulating the robot behind the camera. So people didn't know the robot was not autonomous. But it was being controlled by a human, so we can make it flawless. So it had no failure at all. In the low impact failure, the robot had a failure like you'll see in the video, but people still managed to escape the room, so they won the game still. And in the high impact condition, when the robot failed, they lost the game. So there was no way for them to escape the room, game over, and so on. So that's how we try to manipulate this effect of robot failure. And you'll see what the failure was in the video here. Okay. Let's play.
Turn left 90 degrees.
Sure.
Move forward. Stop. Turn right 90 degrees.
Okay, right.
So Pepper needed to go through this maze that humans
Move forward
couldn't
onto
touch
the key.
and find the key so they could escape the room. And this is the
Stop.
control condition, so everything went fine.
Congratulations. We escaped the room. Please wait for the experimenter to come in. Nice work.
Thank you.
So now is the low impact condition, so robot fails, but they still manage to win the game.
Okay, forward
Okay, forward.
and stop. Stop, Pepper.
Oh
Okay.
no, I've been spotted by the security camera. Quick,
Oh,
let's
okay.
escape the room.
Move back
Okay,
and stop. And now to the right.
sure.
And move forward. Quick, Pepper. Great, you made it. You made it to the key.
Congratulations. We escaped the room. Please wait for the experimenter to come in.
Great.
Nice work.
Good job, Pepper. Thank you so much.
And now high impact failure, Pepper is gonna mess up and they're gonna stuck in the room forever.
Turn left. Turn left.
Okay, left.
Straight. Sorry, forward.
Okay, forward.
Stop. Stop. Stop.
Oh no, I've been spotted by the security camera. Game over. We did not escape the room.
What game
Please
over?
wait for the experimenter
I told
to
you
come
stop, I told you.
This participant was not happy. But anyway, so each one of the people we brought into the lab, they had no prior experience with robots, and they, interacted with Pepper in one of these conditions. And then there was this, error, failure at the end of the robot or not, depending on which condition they were randomly assigned to. So in terms of results, they filled some questionnaires on, perceived trust, perceived warmth, so it's the appearance of the robot, like a trait, competence, discomfort, and so on. And contrary to what we were expecting, we found no significant differences in these quantitative results, except for perceived robustness. So people in the low impact failure found the robot, rated the robot lower in terms of robustness than the other one. So it's a bit counterintuitive, right? The high impact failure, the one that made them lost the game, was perceived as more robust, maybe because it was a bit more coherent. We're still not sure. We also had some open-ended answers where we interviewed participants at the end and asked them about what went wrong and so on. And in those questions, actually, that were also in terms of how they perceived the robot, in the control condition, they felt the robot as more as an assistant. And in the other two conditions, they talked about Pepper more as of a teammate. So the fact that the robot failed, in a way, made this robot to be perceived more a bit as with a human-like trait overall. Also, in terms of the robot's performance, in the high-impact condition, they mentioned the mistake. Oh yeah, that was a failure. The robot didn't understand when I said the move right and so on. But they also compensated for that. So they talked about other positive things about the robot. In the similar way, when we talk, they also mentioned a lot of blame. They almost blame themselves as well. So it's like they see this robot as a teammate, and they try to be nice to the robot when they are when the robot fail to them. So in this case, it was a game. So we need to think of the context of the interaction. But the name of the paper, then it's take one for the team. So when the robot failed, the participants were more willing to take one for the team and consider Pepper as a teammate than when the robot was perfect and they were interacting in the control condition. Again, there are some limitations here. So everyone, it was just a game. So one of the aspects that we could have made even more, high impact would be if participants wouldn't get paid or something like that, which is something we cannot really do in Sweden. But a lot of the trust research and failure and so on also is around, you put participants in a situation that if there's some failure, they don't receive some compensation, or they get twice as much if something happens, and then the results could have been different in that case. Any quick questions or sure?
Yeah, I think could follow the concept of low impact condition, high impact condition. Is that kind of a parameter you configure into the robot, or it's about the environment?
Yes.
So which one is the right one?
Can
you repeat the question so we can have it on the net also?
Okay, so the question was about how we manipulated low impact versus high impact So in the low impact condition, even though the robot failed, so it's not only into the robot, so the robot's behavior in the low impact and the high impact failure was the same. The robot failed. But in the low impact, this failure caused participants to lose the game. To not lose the game, they still escape the room. Whereas in the high impact condition, participants lost the game because of this robot failure. So in a sense, the robot behavior was exactly the same in the two failure cases, but the outcome of the task was different. So there was, robot-related traits, but also environmental-related traits in the.
Did you experiment with different capabilities of the robot?
Only this one. So the tricky thing when you run a controlled study and you want to evaluate something is the more things you manipulate, then you're not sure which one that you change actually made a difference, right? So you need to be very careful in what how you design the experiment such that things actually are equal enough. So for example, even though the control condition was a bit different, we had to make sure that there was similar duration of the task. So the failure only happened at the end such that all participants had around the same time of interaction with the robot, because if they lost the game right in the beginning, then we could have attributed the results to the failure, but also to the fact that they spend less time with the robot. So when we manipulate things, we need to manipulate one by one, and then bring an extra 30 people in to evaluate what we changed. All right, so in the sake of time, let's move to the second case study where we were studying human-robot proxemics in virtual reality and the real world. And the motivation for this study was actually we're interested to see how we can use virtual reality as a quick prototyping tool to study how people perceive robots. Because if you think of, well, there's some disadvantages because the VR headsets are still not perfect in terms of resolution and so on, but we can have very efficient data collection. Imagine we don't have to bring people in the lab. If they have some VR headset at home, they could, run our study and give us some data, and we can, create a virtual robot that we don't have to build, program, and so on, but we can have quick prototyping for example, studying appearance and so on. So the question that we were trying to answer in very general terms was like, but wait a minute, can VR fully reflect how people interact with robots in real time? And we decided to study this in this context of human-robot proxemics, because there's some previous research on how robots approach people and how the personal distance, for example, that people tolerate to robots is different than two humans approaching each other and so on. So based on that, we formulated certain hypotheses given previous literature on virtual reality and so on. So, for example, we expected that participants would require a larger personal space in VR than in the real world, because when you are in VR, distance tend to be more compressed. So we would think, well, then that would make people don't want the virtual robot to approach so close. Also, we expected that the virtual robot would be considered less competent and a bit more discomforting. And we measured this in using established questionnaire that measures certain traits of the robot, like perceived warmth, competence, discomfort, and so on. And also, we thought that participants would have a higher sense of presence when they were in the real world than in virtual reality. So there's this notion of social presence that when you are interacting with some entity, you can measure that. There were also two other things that we wanted to study. So when you have familiar items in VR, that can give you a better sense of space. So we hypothesized that, if we build in VR the exactly lab that people were in, then the distances would be more similar to what we had in the real world than if we had a very unfamiliar environment in VR. And also an hypothesis related to spatial sound. So in VR, the robot was moving but not making any sound, right? But we could engineer the sound coming from, we could simulate sound also in the VR condition to make it more believable. So we expected that by using spatial sound in VR, we would have less differences between the live condition and the VR condition. So this is how the study design went. Participants came in again to the lab, and they interacted with the robot in live. So they let the robot approach, as you'll see, and when they felt like the robot was too close, they were asked to click on the on a headset remote. And then they also interacted with one of these VR conditions. So either the familiarity with sound or the unfamiliar with no sound. So when we manipulate parameters, then we have to try all the different combinations. But then we counterbalance, of course. So some people first do the VR experiment and others did the live. So this was how the experiment looked like.
Now we send it back. We'll do this again.
Mm-hmm. And there was always 2 trials, and then for each participant, we just did the average of those 2. Okay, so this is describing that people had all these different. So one of the initial hypotheses was confirmed. So indeed, participants require larger personal space in VR than in live. So they let the robot approach more in the real robot than the VR robot. And again, this is possibly explained by the fact that in VR, distances are compressed. And also there was this novelty effect, right? So if you are in VR, you're still not sure how things are. So it could be that you don't let some entity come so close to you as if you are comfortable in the real world, even though it's a robot. Then our second hypothesis was partially supported. So in terms of perceived competence, we didn't find any differences. So people didn't think the virtual robot or the real robot was more competent than the other. Although they rated the virtual robot a bit more as discomforting. And that could be because, it was not a perfect 3D model of the robot. The eyes were a bit weird, so that could have affected the results. Or simply because, it was in VR. And then, as expected, when participants are in the real world, they rated the robot as a higher sense of presence than in the virtual reality. And this can be because, virtual reality displays don't have perfect resolution. They are still not, so realistic as they might be in a few years. And also, it could have been that the person, guiding the experiment was in the real world. So even though people were with the VR headset, they were still listening to instructions from real persons. So that could have affected the way they felt like less immersed in VR than. Contrary to our hypothesis, we couldn't find support for these visual familiarity cues and how they affected the minimum comfort distances. So basically adding familiar cues in the VR environment did not improve the space perception and how people let the robot approach. And also we couldn't find a support for the spatial sound hypothesis, which in this case what we did was people were wearing the VR headset, but we had the actual physical robots approach them because that was the way we had to, have the perfect, believable spatial sound into the experiment. It's very difficult to engineer spatial sound that would look very realistic otherwise. And what we think it happened was some participants actually noticed that the robot was moving. And when you feel like a robot is approaching you, but you have some VR headset, it might be that you don't let the robot get as close. So that could have been one limitation. So we would need to rerun this with computer-generated spatial sound and not making the robot move. So we compared how people perceive robots in the real world and in VR, and we confirmed that there's some differences in terms of how people let robots approach in the real world and in VR. But we didn't find support for this visual familiarity or sound effect cues and how they can make it a bit more believable, which is, in a way, a good result because it means that if we want to quickly prototype VR experiments, we don't need to make them perfect. So maybe we don't need to make them the environment as familiar as possible or the best sound possible because it seems that there's no no general differences into how how people perceive these traits. Any quick questions about? Sure.
What was the reason that in VR the distances were perceived smaller than?
That's just the previous. What's the reason to believe that in VR distances are perceived smaller? That comes from previous research that actually shows that if you are in VR and you ask participants to do something, they have they think they are in a smaller distance than they actually are. It's the way the headset, I guess, and the things are configured. But it was not us that. So there's previous research showing that that's something that exists.
Did you try with different models of robots, so with different shapes or
No,
genders?
that would be our next, if we tried with different robot embodiments. So that would be our next step, and we consider that, for example, a less human-like robot or something like that. We haven't tried that, but that would be the natural next step also.
Like with a different gender, because when I think like on Amazon, they have that Alexa. I don't know if that's a difference if you have their male voice.
Yeah, exactly. So this robot is actually designed to be very gender neutral, even though then people, you know, unintentionally tend to attribute gender to the robot, but it was specifically designed to be very gender neutral, such that those effects that you know you have with Alexa and with the Google Voice and so on. But there's definitely a lot of research showing that, you know, if not even a robot, but just a virtual agent with a female voice or with a male voice, there's people perceive the way perceive them differently.
I was thinking probably difficult, but from my understanding, people often get used to automation relatively quickly if it works. So it would be interesting to see over time what would happen.
Exactly.
First time, second time, third time.
For sure. We have done some, you know, repeated interaction studies. I don't like to call them long-term because, you know, if a participant comes 2 or 3 times in the lab, it doesn't count as a long-term interaction, but it's still different than the first encounter. And, you know, it's one of the limitations that we always done. Look, this was done one time, and then if you do it again, when people get used to it, most of the times people actually compensate for these errors or for these. So it's definitely different, but the logistics of recruiting someone and you know, making them come to the lab more than once, and they are quite difficult. So most of the human-robot interaction studies are one instance, but there's definitely more you know, incentives to get repeated interactions because that definitely changes. Okay. So final case study. And this one was work that I did not at KTH, but when I was a postdoc at Disney Research. So the type of users here are kids. And like you saw, the first, I think the first factor on the personal traits of user trust is age. And there's actually a lot of different challenges when you want to study age differences in human-robot interaction, in particular with children. So first, you know, if you want to study age, you need a large sample size because you need to collect sample of different ages. And especially when you think of kids that go through several developmental stages, it's very different to study a 5-year-old and an 11-year-old. Whereas with an adults, you can, you know, assume that you have like around 50 years that your brain will be kind of similar, although of course people change. So it's a bit more challenging to study this interaction with kids, but it's also very interesting because kids don't have these preconceptions of robots or you know, what to expect from this system. So and of course Disney was extremely interested in studying these things with the appearance of, you know, all these conversational devices like Amazon, Alexa, even some toys like the Hello Barbie that it's supposed to talk with you and have a personalized conversation with you and so on. And there are a lot of potential privacy issues when you know, these systems talk with kids and when they try to personalize interaction with kids. So the question that we wanted to study here was, in the increasingly likely situation that the robot has access to some piece of information that the child doesn't know the robot has, if the robot discloses that information, first, will the kids notice that? And second, how will they perceive the robot afterwards? So this was the challenge that we wanted to address in this study. And so this was the robot that we used. It was a bit less human-like. We call it Jimmy, and it was actually developed at Disney Research, so this was the only model, then they created another one. And it was, again, human-operated. So there was a human operator in the back with a Jimmy skeleton. So whatever you would do here, you would have the robot also in there. And then the robot would speak to the child. So the interaction here We had a storytelling task that I'll explain a bit later, and then we had a study with 28 children where we had two different conditions. Our control condition, where there's no disclosure of private information, and then our experimental condition when the robot discloses some private information. So the way it happens was like this. First, the child and the parent. So again, we're talking between 4-year-olds to 12, I think this age range. So some of the kids were more comfortable with the parents around, and also we used parents for some results that I'll show you later. But they were performing a paper storytelling activity. And they always opened this box with two characters, which was this hot dog guy and the whirlwind. And they was asked to tell a story with these two characters. And after that, they were guided to this table that had other characters, and they were asked, okay, you can choose the next two characters and put in the treasure box for the next kid to tell a story. And they were doing this outside of the experiment view, any cameras, so they were doing this by themselves only. So they thought only they would know what was in the box. But these paper characters had an RFID tag on them, so we could track which characters kids put in the box. So in a way, the robot will know the characters that the kids have in the box, although they think there's no possible way that they can do. So they pick the two next superheroes for the story, and then they go and talk with this Jimmy robot that I told you about. And they have this brief 5-minute conversation, and at some point on the interaction, Jimmy tells the child, oh, I wish I could also tell a story. I would pick, and in the control condition, Jimmy says, I would pick hot dog guy and the world guy, which are the ones that they already talked about and were the ones that they had in the story. In the experimental condition, Jimmy says, I would pick, dragon and octopus, just like you did. So basically revealing the characters that the child had in the closed box in front of them. And so what we measured here was several things. For example, how kids' gaze patterns change between when this reveal is happening in the story. And what we found was that in the experimental condition, there's a much more frequency of gaze shifts when the reveal happened. And these gaze shifts are elsewhere, so not to the robot, not to the humans. So the kids get a little confused and they try to avoid eye contact with the robot when, this violation of privacy happens. Also, we ask parents to rate the effective reaction of their child in this moment that Jimmy tells the story. And what we found was that parents rated that child's positive effect as much more positive in the control condition when there's no violation of private information than in the experimental condition. So kids get a bit more sad or a bit more shocked when there's this reveal of personal information. And we also found some, age and gender differences. So these effects were much more evident in the older kids when you divide by the two different age groups. And also girls' effect was more positive in the controlled and the experimental condition. So there was a bit of a gender difference as well. Also, in terms of how children rated the robot as being a good storyteller or not, in the control condition, the kids in the control condition thought the robot was a much better storyteller than for the experimental condition. So there's definitely differences here, but the way you need to ask these things to kids is very different than, for example, you would do with some adult interaction. So did children notice the robot's conversational violation? Yes, but the reaction depended on their age and gender. Did it matter? Well, despite this immediate response that there was higher gaze shifts and a bit less positive effect, the rest of the results remain similar. And again, this could have been because this was one instance of one conversational violation. And there was nothing with personal impact. It's like a character in the story. So there's, again, no risk, or which would be hard to do with kids, but there's always these things that we need to consider when we analyze results of such HRI studies. Any questions about this one? Probably just want to have lunch, right? Okay, so just a brief summary as a preparation for tomorrow. I told you about these 3 different case studies, how people perceive robots when they fail in the escape the room scenario, how people perceive robots when they get too close to them in the human-robot proxemics in VR and the virtual in the real world, and how kids perceive robots when robots disclose this personal information that kids think only they know about. So I think the main takeaway is that this field of human-robot interaction is quite interdisciplinary. My background is computer science, but I need to take inspiration from experimental psychology to understand how to how to properly design and create these experimental settings that allow us to validate or not these hypotheses that we formulate about how people perceive robots and so on. There can be many different factors influencing how human and robots collaborate and how people trust or perceive robots in general. And there are many promising application domains. So of course, this is an area worth, or I believe, exploring because of the societal impact that can have. So again, this is our main slide for tomorrow, and I hope to see you at 9 a.m. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Oh.